On the night meant for celebration, a family was wiped out, and the man who once believed he had finally found happiness would soon turn his grief into a weapon. The music, the lights, the laughter, none of it survived what happened next. It should have been the night that united families, the night two hearts were meant to become one. Instead, it became a night soaked in silence, confusion, and a terror no one at that wedding would ever forget. A single torn veil lay abandoned near the entrance, fluttering lightly in the warm evening breeze. A wedding cake stood untouched, its perfect white frosting smeared by the chaos of rushing footsteps. Police tape blurred against the flashing lights as paramedics moved in and out like shadows, and on the ground, half hidden beneath a rose petal, a single bullet casing gleamed under the street lamp, small, cold, and unforgiving. No one could yet understand how a celebration had turned into a massacre. No one knew why a woman and her child were found lifeless only minutes after dancing under the chandelier. And no one could imagine that the man now shaking uncontrollably outside the venue would soon be holding a gun of his own, emptied into the body of the person he once loved. But what the investigators uncovered next changed the whole story. The evening had begun with nothing but joy, the kind that softens faces and makes even strangers feel like family. The reception hall glowed under golden lights, and the sound of clinking glasses mixed with soft music drifting from hidden speakers. The smell of fresh roses filled the room. Laughter rolled gently across tables, adorned with white linen. Everything looked perfect from the outside. Too perfect, some would later say, as if the night itself had been trying too hard to hide what was coming. Emmanuel had spent weeks preparing every detail for this wedding. He moved through the crowd with the nervous excitement of a man finally stepping into the life he'd always wanted. He greeted guests with warm handshakes and shy smiles, adjusting the sleeves of his suit every few minutes, as if he still couldn't believe the day had come. Friends described him as the calm center of the stormy world he had lived in, a steady hand, a patient father, a man who had weathered too many disappointments and thought tonight marked a new beginning. Aisha, radiant in her gown, floated from table to table with the kind of grace that made people stop mid-sentence just to watch her pass. Her son, little Luca, clung to her veil as he followed, toddling eagerly, occasionally stumbling, but always smiling. Every time she lifted him into her arms, the room seemed to brighten. She was the anchor of the family, the gentle voice, the one who loved fiercely and forgave easily. Her friends often said she carried sunlight inside her. Yet even in a room filled with celebration, a few guests felt something in the air that didn't sit right. They couldn't explain it. Just a faint tension, like a thin crack beneath a polished floor. A subtle shift in the atmosphere that most people brushed aside. A whisper here, a glance there, fragments of unease that made little sense at the time. Some noticed a short argument near the back of the hall, just shadows moving behind a curtain, voices low but sharp enough to catch attention before fading into the noise. Others recalled Emmanuel checking his phone repeatedly, slipping away for brief moments, returning with a faint crease between his brows. Aisha seemed slightly distracted at times, her smile dimming for a heartbeat before returning, as though she was trying to bury something beneath her joy. And then there was Maya. She stood near the exit, partially hidden by a cluster of decorative lights, a striking woman with a presence that was both beautiful and unsettling. She wasn't part of the wedding party, yet she wasn't exactly a stranger either. A few guests whispered, trying to remember where they had seen her before. Her eyes followed Emmanuel more often than she let others notice, and every time he passed close to her, she looked away just a little too slowly. For those who paid attention, her body language carried an unspoken weight, a restlessness, a sadness, a tightness around the jaw that suggested she was holding back something strong. Anger, heartbreak, fear. No one could tell. She clutched her phone like a lifeline, checking its screen repeatedly, the glow illuminating her face in brief flashes. One guest later recalled seeing her wipe her eyes quickly, pretending to adjust her makeup. No one knew that just an hour before the ceremony, a message had appeared on her phone, a message that would later become a key to everything. A few blurred words, a timestamp, a silence that followed, a silence she couldn't shake. Back inside the hall, the happiness felt genuine but fragile. The music was soft but carried an edge, as if stretched thin by everything happening behind the scenes. The lights flickered once, just a simple electrical hiccup, they said. But for those whose eyes were already searching for meaning, the flicker felt like a warning, like the night itself was exhaling in dread. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the ribbons tied to the fence. Inside, the air felt heavy. Emmanuel and Aisha took their first dance, spinning slowly under the chandelier, her hand resting on his shoulder, his fingers trembling slightly as he held her waist. Luca sat on a relative's lap, clapping as he watched his mother and Emmanuel move together, like two people desperately trying to believe this was their moment of safety, peace, and forever. But beneath the beauty of that dance, beneath the flowers and the music and the smiles, something else lingered, unseen, unspoken, a tension coiling tighter with every minute, a detail someone noticed but didn't understand, a glance that lasted a second too long, a phone call unanswered, a person missing from the crowd, a door that hadn't been closed properly. Tiny signs that seemed harmless then, but would soon become pieces of a nightmare no one could escape. Because while the room was filled with love, celebration, and hope, a shadow was already moving through the edges of the night, quiet and deliberate. A shadow that would soon change everything forever. The shadow did not move with haste, nor with hesitation. It drifted with the controlled precision of someone who had replayed this moment in their mind far too many times. Outside the hall, where the glow of the lights faded into the open dark, Maya's breath left her in uneven waves. She stepped away from the entrance, blending into the dim corridor that led toward the gowns room, a place no one had reason to visit now that the ceremony was over. Her heels clicked softly, but even that sound carried tension, like footsteps trying not to wake something that was already wide awake. Inside the hall, Emmanuel continued dancing, but his smile had begun to feel like something glued onto his face rather than born from joy. He had felt it, the moment Maya entered the building. He didn't need to see her to know. The old sensations returned, the ones he thought he buried long ago, the ones that came with memories he refused to speak about. It wasn't guilt that gripped him. It was fear. A quiet, enduring fear that Maya never knew how to let go, even when he begged her to. Aisha, pressed close to him, felt the shift long before he admitted anything was wrong. She leaned in, whispering something only he could hear, her voice filled with warmth, but also with the curiosity of a woman who sensed there were pages in Emmanuel's story she had never been allowed to read. He squeezed her hand gently, as if asking her not to push further. Not tonight. But Aisha wasn't blind. She had noticed the way his eyes kept drifting toward the entrance, searching for someone he never named. She had noticed how his heartbeat picked up whenever his phone vibrated. She had noticed the deleted messages weeks earlier. She never confronted him, hoping it was nothing, hoping love would outweigh suspicion. But tonight, the feeling gnawed at her again, sharper than before. Meanwhile, far across the room, an elderly aunt whispered to her husband. She didn't like the woman standing by the lights. Something about her posture, her expression. It didn't carry the softness people bring to weddings. It carried the stiffness of someone fighting themselves. The husband dismissed it as wedding stress, but even he couldn't ignore how Maya kept wiping her face, like she was trying to erase something she didn't want anyone to see. Maya leaned against the wall of the empty corridor, gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles paled. She stared at the last message she received an hour earlier. 6 words. That was all? 6 words that stabbed through her chest with a truth she could no longer deny. 6 words that explained everything. 6 words that destroyed everything. She closed her eyes, pressing the phone against her forehead, whispering something only the walls could hear. Outside the hall, laughter erupted again, muffled through the door, sounding distant, almost mocking. She inhaled sharply. She wasn't supposed to be here. She told herself she wouldn't come. She swore she wouldn't let her emotions ruin their day. But emotions have a way of ignoring promises, especially when those emotions have been fed with secrets, with half-truths, with pain that never found closure. Inside, Aisha made her way back to Luca, lifting him gently from the relative's lap. His tiny arms wrapped around her neck as she held him close. She pressed her cheek against his soft curls, breathing him in, grounding herself. She felt Emmanuel watching her, and she smiled, the kind of smile that could soften the hardest moments. But beneath that smile, a question lingered. Who was the woman he kept avoiding with his eyes? Emmanuel excused himself quietly. No one noticed at first, not until he crossed the hall with a purpose he tried to hide beneath calm steps. He slipped into the corridor, leaving the music and the smiles behind. The cool air hit him instantly, and so did the weight he had been trying to outrun all evening. At the far end, he saw Maya. She didn't look up at first. Her shoulders were trembling slightly, and her fingers kept tapping against her phone like she was holding on to the last thread of sanity. When she finally raised her eyes and met his, everything inside him froze. There it was, that silent storm she always carried, that intensity that once drew him in but later suffocated him. Her eyes glistened with a mix of longing and devastation. The kind that comes when love turns into something darker and harder to control. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Maya, you shouldn't be here. She let out a broken laugh, wiping her cheeks quickly. I know I shouldn't. But then you sent this. She held up the phone with a shaking hand. He stared at the screen, his breath hitching. He didn't respond immediately. He felt the room tighten around him, the air, the walls, her stare. Maya, I didn't mean, you did, her voice cracked. You always meant it. You just never had the courage to say it out loud. He looked away, rubbing the back of his neck. Things are different now. I'm building something without me. Her voice broke, and with that break came the truth he tried to bury. Something flickered behind her eyes, a pain that was turning into anger. A dangerous kind of anger. Back in the hall, Aisha glanced toward the corridor. That prickling sensation returned, the one that warned her something wasn't right. She kissed Luca's forehead and whispered for a relative to watch him for a moment. Without drawing attention, she made her way toward the hallway, the echo of her footsteps swallowed by the music. The corridor was dim. The air was tense. She slowed her pace, hearing pieces of their voices drifting toward her, the kind of soft arguing only people who shared history could produce. Emmanuel's tone was strained. Maya's was shaking. Aisha's pulse quickened. She stepped closer, each footstep careful. She heard Maya say something that stopped her heart cold. If you think you can just erase me, you don't know me at all. Then a sound, a sharp inhale, a struggling breath. Aisha froze. She wasn't supposed to hear this. She wasn't supposed to know. But the truth had begun leaking through the cracks, and once truth escapes, It never goes back quietly. Behind them all, the shadow that had been moving since the night finally took shape in the doorway, waiting for its moment. Because every tragedy begins with a detail overlooked, a conversation overheard, a choice made too late. And tonight, those pieces were aligning with terrifying precision. The wedding was still filled with music, still filled with love, still filled with hope. But that hope was already dying in the hallway, slowly, silently, and no one saw the fatal shift. The air in the corridor grew heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Emmanuel took a cautious step back, putting a small distance between himself and Maya. But the space didn't soften anything. It only made the tension stretch thinner, sharper, ready to snap. Maya swallowed hard, her jaw trembling as she wiped her eyes again, though more tears threatened to surface. "You promised you wouldn't leave me," she whispered, her voice fragile but charged with something deeper. "You promised you'd tell her everything." Emmanuel shook his head slowly, running a hand over his face. "I said we'd talk. I said I needed time. Not tonight, Maya. Not on my wedding night." "Your wedding night," she repeated under her breath, each word burning as it left her lips. "You really went through with it. You actually married her." Her voice cracked on the last word. The pain in her eyes sharpened into something more dangerous, something that had been building for months, maybe years. She looked at him like he had taken something precious from her, something she believed was hers long before Aisha ever entered the picture. Emmanuel exhaled, defeated. You knew this had to end." Maya's lips parted slightly, as if he had slapped her with the words alone. She staggered a half-step backward, gripping her phone to keep her balance. Her eyes darkened. "And? You think this ends tonight?" A faint rustle echoed from behind them. Aisha, standing just around the corner, hidden from sight, but close enough to hear every word. She pressed her back against the wall, her hand covering her mouth. Her heartbeat pounded against her palm, each thump heavier than the last. She wasn't expecting this. She wasn't prepared for the truth delivered like a blade to the chest. Aisha had always trusted Emmanuel, always believed in him, always felt safe in his arms. But the conversation unfolding in the corridor felt like the cracks of her world breaking open. She didn't know whether to confront them or run. Her breath trembled as she fought the urge to step into the light and demand answers. But before she could move, Maya spoke again, louder, this time trembling with resolve. "You said you loved me," she hissed softly. "Maybe you forget those words, but I don't. I held on to them. I changed my life for them. And now you stand here and pretend none of it mattered? Maya, please." "No." Her voice rose, echoing through the corridor. Aisha flinched at the sound. Emmanuel closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself. He reached out, gently but firmly catching Maya's wrist. "Listen to me. I care about you, but not like that anymore. I moved on. You have to let this go." "Let this go," Maya whispered, nodding slowly, but not in agreement, in disbelief, in heartbreak. "So I was just a placeholder, a secret, something you hide in the dark while you play the perfect husband in the light." Emmanuel lowered his voice, glancing back at the hall. "Please, if Aisha hears—" "Oh, she should hear," Maya said, her voice trembling, but now with a bitter smile forming. "She deserves the truth. Maybe she should know what kind of man she married." Aisha's hand tightened on the wall, her breath catching. Tears welled in her eyes as her chest rose and fell in small, panicked waves. Emmanuel stepped closer to Maya, desperate now. "Don't do this. Not tonight. Not like this." Her mouth twisted into something broken, agonized. "I gave you everything, Emmanuel. Every part of me. And you act like I'm nothing." He shook his head. "You're not nothing." "Then why wasn't I enough?" she whispered, her voice splintering. The question hung in the air like a fragile ornament on the edge of falling. It was the kind of question that had no gentle answer, no safe reply. Emmanuel looked away, and in that silence, Maya found her answer. Aisha felt tears slide down her cheeks, unable to stop them. She had never heard Emmanuel sound like this, torn, regretful, guilty. A part of her had always sensed something deeper beneath the surface, but she told herself it was insecurity, not truth. Now the truth stood before her, cruel and undeniable. Maya's next words were a whisper filled with doom. "If I can't have you, no one should." Emmanuel froze. What does that mean? But before she could answer, a door creaked somewhere down the corridor. Footsteps, a distant voice calling for Emmanuel. The spell broke. Maya swallowed hard, her expression hardening into something unreadable. She stumbled backward, wiping her face aggressively. "This isn't over," she whispered, almost to herself. "Not tonight." She turned and walked away, disappearing into a darker hallway, leaving Emmanuel standing alone under the dim light, shaking, not from fear, but from the sickening realization that something had shifted, something irreversible. Aisha stepped away before he could see her. She slipped into the bridal suite, closing the door quietly. She pressed her hands to her face, muffling her sobs. The veil she wore just hours ago now lay crumpled on the couch behind her, still carrying traces of her perfume. The weight of betrayal settled over her, suffocating and cold. In the hallway, Emmanuel leaned against the wall, his breath shallow. He knew Maya wasn't stable tonight. He knew the message she received had pushed her to the edge. He knew he needed to find her before she did something reckless. But he didn't know, couldn't know, that Aisha had heard everything. And he didn't know that Maya wasn't the only person unraveling. The night continued outside as if nothing was wrong. Music, laughter, clinking glasses. A celebration carrying on while a storm brewed in the corners no one was watching. And while all eyes stayed fixed on the dance floor, the real danger slipped deeper into the shadows, waiting for its moment to strike. The corridor was silent now, save for the faint hum of the reception drifting through the walls. Emmanuel moved cautiously, each step careful. His mind racing. He needed to find Maya before anyone else got caught in whatever storm had overtaken her. He knew instinctively that she was dangerous tonight, not in some imagined way, but in a way that could destroy everything he had built, everything he loved. He reached the end of the hall, where the dim emergency lights cast long, jagged shadows across the floor. The door to the storage area stood slightly ajar. He hesitated, a cold feeling settling into his stomach. Something inside him urged caution, but another voice, sharper, more primal, pushed him forward. He opened the door fully, and the smell hit him first. A faint metallic tang that didn't belong, something acrid in the air, impossible to ignore. Maya was there. She hadn't expected him to follow. Her eyes widened as she pressed herself against the far wall. Her hands shook, clutching her phone as if it were a weapon. The soft glow from the screen illuminated her pale face, making the shadows beneath her eyes look like cracks in the night. "Emmanuel," she whispered, voice small but edged with panic. "You shouldn't have." "Stop it, Maya!" he snapped, his voice louder than intended. "Whatever this is, it has to end now. Not here, not like this." Her gaze flicked down for a moment, catching the edge of something on the floor, something dark that shimmered faintly under the light. She looked back up at him, and the faint smile that twisted her lips was no longer pleading. It was calculated, cold, and terrifying. "You think I came here by accident?" she said. "You think I'm just lost? No. I came here for a reason. Everything you built tonight, your happiness, your family, it's mine. I told you once, Emmanuel. If I can't have it, no one can." Her words hit him like a physical blow. His chest tightened, heart hammering so violently he thought it might burst. The metallic smell grew stronger, mingling with the floral scents still lingering from the reception. Emmanuel stepped closer, but instinct screamed at him to back up. Suddenly, a movement in the hallway outside caught his attention. Aisha's voice, faint but unmistakable, called out. "Emmanuel, where are you?" Maya's head snapped toward the sound, her face twisted, rage and panic intertwining. "She doesn't get to save him?" she hissed under her breath. And that's when Emmanuel saw it, the glint of something sharp in her hand. A knife, slender and cruel, catching the light. He froze. Time slowed. He wanted to speak, to reason, to reach her, but fear rooted him in place. Maya's eyes locked onto his, wild, desperate, unrelenting. "Emmanuel, you'll see," she whispered, stepping closer. "Tonight, everyone will pay." The corridor became suffocating. The walls seemed to shrink, closing in around them. Emmanuel's mind raced, searching for any solution, any way to stop the inevitable. But he knew, deep down, that no words could reach her. Not now. Not tonight. The darkness in her had grown too large, too fast. He thought of Luca. He thought of Aisha. He thought of the life he had dreamed of and realized it could end in seconds, all because of a shadow that had been moving unseen, unnoticed, for months. A creak from behind startled them both. Maya turned toward the sound, momentarily distracted, and that split second was all Emmanuel needed. He lunged, trying to wrest the knife away, but she was fast, trained, fueled by obsession. The struggle was violent, chaotic, and silent outside the world that carried laughter and music. And then the first shot rang out. The sound shattered the night, a deafening crack that echoed through the hall, silencing music, laughter, and celebration. Guests froze mid-motion, the clink of glasses hanging in the air like suspended notes. Aisha screamed, heart-stopping, as the reality of the moment finally pierced the celebration's fragile veil. Emmanuel staggered back, hands trembling, eyes wide. Maya fell to the floor, her expression one of shock, mingled with a faint, twisted satisfaction. 10 shots. 10 times the gun barked, each one a punctuation mark on a night, meant for love, but rewritten as nightmare. The hall erupted into chaos. Screams, shouts, people pushing, running, some collapsing in terror. Music stopped abruptly, leaving only the ringing in ears, the smell of gunpowder, and the surreal understanding that life as everyone knew it had been shattered in seconds. Emmanuel sank to the floor, shaking violently, staring at Maya's still form, at the blood, at the impossibility of what had just happened. His life, his family, his happiness, all destroyed, all in a heartbeat. And outside the wreckage, in the shadows just beyond the doors, a silent figure watched, waiting for the police, waiting for the aftermath, watching as the carefully built illusion of a perfect night crumbled into horror. The wedding that was supposed to be a celebration of love had become a story of grief, rage, and vengeance. And for Emmanuel, nothing would ever be the same. The reception hall was a scene of chaos. Guests ran in every direction, some screaming, some sobbing, some frozen in shock, unable to process the violence that had erupted in what was supposed to be the happiest night of their lives. Tables were overturned, chairs scattered, champagne glasses shattered. their contents mingling with the first drops of blood that had already stained the floor. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of gunpowder, mingling with the lingering scent of roses, creating a grotesque contrast between celebration and carnage. Police and security arrived within minutes, though to those inside it felt like hours. Officers pushed through the crowd, their flashlights cutting through the dim emergency lighting, illuminating faces twisted with horror and disbelief. Screams echoed off the walls as people were ushered toward exits, their bodies trembling, their hands shaking uncontrollably. Emergency medical personnel rushed in, but the reality of the scene was immediate and unrelenting. Lives had been lost, a family destroyed, and no one truly understood why. Investigators combed the scene carefully. Bullet casings littered the floor, each one a silent witness to the sequence of shots fired. The trajectory of each shot was meticulously documented, revealing the moments of panic, hesitation, and rage that had unfolded in mere seconds. Blood splattered across the walls, and floor told the story with brutal clarity. Forensic teams began photographing every angle, examining fingerprints, DNA, and even the subtle marks of struggle on the hardwood and tile surfaces. Witness statements were collected, each adding layers of understanding to the night's horror. Some recalled seeing Maya loitering near the exit in the hour leading up to the shooting, her eyes darting toward Emmanuel repeatedly. Others mentioned her checking her phone obsessively, as though awaiting a signal that would dictate the timing of the attack. Security footage revealed subtle movements, her slipping behind tables, pausing in hallways, waiting, calculating, observing. Each frame offered new insight, each detail building the case that this had been premeditated. Detectives began interviewing Emmanuel, who sat in shock, still clutching the gun he had used in desperation and grief. His hands trembled uncontrollably. He recounted the conversation in the hallway, the mounting tension with Maya, and the final split-second decision that had ended her life. His voice was hoarse, raw with grief and disbelief. Recounting every moment as though reliving it in slow motion, the investigators noted inconsistencies, not in his story, but in the almost impossible intensity of his emotional state. Recognizing the thin line between protective instinct and calculated vengeance that had been crossed in seconds. Autopsies would later confirm the sequence of events. 10 gunshot wounds, each fired in rapid succession, indicating both the ferocity and desperation of Emmanuel's actions. Forensic analysts reconstructed the scene meticulously, using trajectory calculations, blood spatter analysis, and ballistic mapping to ensure the story of that hallway could be told with absolute precision. Every detail mattered. The angle of the shots, the positioning of the bodies, the struggle marks on the walls and floor. The placement of the phone still clutched in Maya's hand, all of it painting a picture of a man pushed beyond the limits of grief and reason, confronting a threat he could no longer contain. Meanwhile, detectives traced the last communications between Emmanuel and Maya. Messages, calls, and deleted conversations revealed a complex history of obsession, betrayal, and manipulation. It became evident that Maya had been planning her actions for months, feeding on resentment, jealousy, and a twisted sense of ownership over Emmanuel's life. The investigators began to piece together the motive, the timeline, and the opportunity, creating a meticulous reconstruction of the psychological and physical events that led to the tragedy. Family and friends were interviewed, their grief raw and palpable. They described Maya's earlier behavior, sudden disappearances, obsessive tendencies, confrontations with Emmanuel, and the subtle warnings no one had understood until it was too late. Witnesses recalled fleeting moments of tension during the reception, glances that lingered too long, arguments whispered behind closed doors, the uneasy feeling that someone in the room was waiting for the perfect moment. As the investigation progressed, the story that emerged was dark and multifaceted. It was not just a crime of passion, it was the culmination of obsession, fear, and unrelenting psychological pressure. The evidence painted a picture of a woman who had once been close to Emmanuel, but had crossed the boundaries of reason, her actions driven by a mixture of desperation, jealousy, and distorted love. Each revelation added layers to the horror, keeping investigators, and eventually the public, gripped by the intricacy and tragedy of the events. By the time the forensic teams had finished reconstructing the scene and compiling witness statements, the narrative of the night was clear. A wedding night meant for celebration had been consumed by obsession and rage, culminating in a violent confrontation that ended in death and despair. But even with every detail recorded, questions remained. Questions that would lead to further revelations about the true depth of Maya's intentions, the psychological pressure she exerted, and the irreversible choices Emmanuel had been forced to make. The investigation was far from over, and with each new piece of evidence, the story of that night became more harrowing. The crime scene, once a place of joy and laughter, had transformed into a chilling tableau of human emotion pushed beyond its breaking point, an enduring reminder that beneath even the brightest celebrations, shadows can lie in wait, ready to erupt when least expected. The investigation had barely begun when the first shocking revelations surfaced. Detective Alvarez sat in the small, sterile office, flipping through pages of interviews, security footage, and phone records. Each piece of evidence seemed to pull the narrative in a darker, more complicated direction than anyone had anticipated. At first glance, the crime appeared straightforward, a man protecting his family from a threatening presence. But as the layers were peeled back, the truth revealed a web of manipulation, obsession, and betrayal far beyond what Emmanuel, or anyone, had imagined. Security footage showed Maya's movements with unsettling precision. She had been at the hall for hours before the shooting, weaving through corners, observing, calculating. But hidden in the frames were subtle interactions with others, moments that initially seemed inconsequential. A brief conversation with a catering staff member, a passing exchange with a guest she had never met before, even the way she adjusted her gloves repeatedly. Each small detail hinted at careful preparation, as if she had been setting the stage for something catastrophic. Phone records painted a more damning picture. Deleted messages recovered by forensic specialists revealed months of obsession. Texts sent at odd hours, repeated pleas for Emmanuel to leave Aisha, warnings of consequences if he chose otherwise. There were also cryptic references to a past incident that no one had fully understood at the time, a history that seemed to explain the depth of Maya's fixation. Investigators began piecing together the psychological timeline, how her resentment had festered, how her sense of entitlement had escalated, and how the night of the wedding had become the inevitable climax of her obsession. Witnesses provided their own chilling accounts. Some remembered minor incidents in the weeks leading up to the wedding. Maya appearing uninvited at Emmanuel's home, sending gifts meant for Luca that were laced with notes of guilt and blame, the way she lingered around him during family gatherings. Others noted subtle threats masked as playful comments, moments that, in hindsight, were clear warning signs. The combination of these accounts established a pattern, an escalating series of provocations, culminating in the events that had left the wedding hall in ruins. Perhaps most startling were the findings regarding Maya's state of mind that night. Forensic psychologists consulted on the case suggested she had been operating under extreme emotional duress, coupled with a desire to control Emmanuel and punish anyone standing in her way. They described her obsession as methodical, almost ritualistic, a series of calculated steps designed to provoke fear and force confrontation. The combination of her premeditated planning, her psychological instability, and the final confrontation with Emmanuel created a perfect storm, one that no one in the hall had been prepared to survive. Then came the final, undeniable revelation. In a storage locker near her apartment, investigators found a meticulously kept journal, filled with entries detailing her fixation on Emmanuel, her hatred toward Aisha, and her growing conviction that the wedding could not go on without consequences. The journal contained sketches, timelines, and notes that read like a script for a crime drama, a horrifying testament to the extent of her planning. Every sentence was a window into a mind consumed by obsession, every page a map leading to the night's ultimate tragedy. The pieces fell into place. The small arguments near the back of the hall, the glances that lingered too long, the deleted messages on Emmanuel's phone. They were not random, not coincidental. They were the prologue, the meticulous build-up to a night that had spiraled into murder. Investigators finally understood the magnitude of what had occurred. A woman's obsession had intersected with a man's love and grief in a way that could not have been predicted, yet had been meticulously orchestrated from the shadows. When the detectives finally confronted Emmanuel with the full scope of Maya's manipulations, he could barely breathe. Each revelation was a knife, twisting deeper into a wound already raw. He realized the depth of the danger he had faced, the thin line between protective instinct and catastrophic action, and the sheer inevitability that Maya's plan had almost succeeded. Every hesitation, every glance, every misstep in the corridor had been anticipated. Only his quick response and the fraught, desperate moments of struggle had prevented further tragedy. The courtroom later described the investigation as exhaustive, meticulous, and chilling in its detail. Every movement, every interaction, every psychological nuance was documented, analyzed, and presented, painting a picture of a crime that was as much about human obsession and emotional distortion as it was about the act of violence itself. The big reveal wasn't just about Maya's guilt. It was about the intricate, almost invisible forces that had driven a night of celebration into a nightmare. And when the final pieces were laid out for the public, the shock was total. Everyone who had believed in the innocence of the evening, the perfect smiles, the laughter, the music, was forced to confront the terrifying truth. The shadow that had moved unnoticed through the night had not acted on impulse. It had acted with intention, with precision, and with a cold determination that left no room for mercy. The wedding that should have been remembered for love and joy was now etched in memory as a night of obsession, manipulation, and death. And as investigators closed their files and the hall's lights were finally turned off, one fact remained undeniable. The truth, once uncovered, had a power far greater than grief, rage, or even revenge. It had the power to redefine everything anyone thought they knew about that night, and about the people who had lived it. The hallway outside the storage room felt impossibly long. Maya had been led into a small, sterile interview room, the weight of handcuffs biting into her wrists, her shoulders tense, eyes darting as if every surface held an enemy. Emmanuel sat on the other side of the glass, separated by a thin pane of reinforced glass that did little to mute the emotional storm between them. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until a detective finally spoke, his tone calm but unyielding. "You know why you're here," he said. "We have the evidence. Every movement, every message, every action. The timeline is clear. The people in that hall trusted you, and you betrayed that trust." Maya's lips quivered, but she refused to look at Emmanuel. Instead, her eyes flitted around the room, lingering on nothing, trying to find some escape, some loophole, some fragment of control she could grasp. I just... Her voice broke. Emmanuel's hand pressed against the glass instinctively. He wanted to reach her, to shake some sense into her, to find a trace of the woman he once thought he knew. But she was gone, replaced by the calculated, dangerous figure who had stalked his life and shattered his family. The detective laid out the evidence methodically, piece by piece. Phone messages, surveillance footage, witness statements, the recovered journal, all pointing to a premeditated obsession that had escalated into violence. Each piece was another hammer blow, not just on Maya's denial, but on Emmanuel's fragile sense of closure. He had hoped that ending the threat that night would bring peace. Instead, he was left staring at the shattered remnants of trust, love, and life itself. Maya finally raised her eyes, meeting Emmanuel's gaze through the glass. It was a look full of defiance, mixed with despair, a silent admission that she understood both the magnitude of what she had done and the inevitability of her fate. I just wanted him to choose me," she whispered. "I never wanted." "You wanted to destroy everything I love," Emmanuel interrupted, voice cracking. "You destroyed my wife, my son. You almost destroyed me. And you have the audacity to say it wasn't meant to happen?" Tears filled her eyes, but they weren't just sorrow. They were anger, resentment, and a chilling sense of twisted satisfaction. "They were in my way," she admitted finally, voice barely audible. "They shouldn't have been there. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. But they made me do it." Emmanuel's chest tightened, every heartbeat a thunderclap. He had imagined confrontations before, but nothing could have prepared him for the cold, deliberate tone in her admission. This was not a moment of remorse. It was a declaration, an explanation, and a confession all at once. The police officers moved to lead her away, the metal of the handcuffs clicking sharply, echoing in the small room. She twisted toward Emmanuel one last time, her eyes fierce, wild, but tinged with a fleeting vulnerability. "It was for us," she said softly, a statement meant to justify, to plead, to reach him. Emmanuel exhaled, the air leaving his lungs in a shuddering rush. "There was never an us," he whispered, voice hollow, echoing through the glass. "You killed my family. You took everything. There was never an us." The room fell silent as she was led down the hallway. Every step she took resonated like the closing of a chapter, too painful to read again. Emmanuel remained seated, staring at the glass, numb, the weight of grief pressing down with unbearable intensity. He could hear the distant chaos of the wedding guests still reeling, but the noise was muted, irrelevant compared to the silence that now enveloped him. Outside, cameras captured the moments as she was escorted to the waiting police vehicle. The public would later see the images, the tension, the subtle flicker of emotions on her face. There was shock, fear, pride, and defiance all mingled together, a final haunting testament to the woman who had orchestrated the night's horrors. Inside the station, Emmanuel sat alone, trying to reconcile the events that had unfolded. Memories of Aisha and Luca flashed before him, her laughter, his tiny hands in hers, the ordinary moments that now seemed impossibly precious. He realized that the nightmare was far from over. There would be trials, media scrutiny, and questions from the world. But for a brief, frozen moment, he allowed himself to grieve, to acknowledge the raw, unfiltered pain of the loss, and to understand the terrifying consequences of obsession and betrayal. Outside, the city moved on, oblivious to the devastation that had occurred in one small hall. But Emmanuel knew that nothing could erase what had happened, that the images, sounds, and memories of that night would remain etched in him forever. The confrontation had ended, but the echoes of that night, the screams, the shots, the shattered trust, would linger, haunting, persistent, and inescapable. And in that lingering shadow, the world understood something painfully clear. Love, when entangled with obsession and rage, could turn celebration into carnage, hope into despair, and life into an unending nightmare. The days after the shooting were a blur of sirens, media coverage, and hushed whispers. The once celebratory hall now sat empty, stripped of flowers, decorations, and laughter, transformed into a hollow reminder of the horror that had unfolded. Investigators continued their work, cataloging every detail. But outside the walls, the ripple effects of that night had already begun to touch lives in ways no one could have anticipated. Emmanuel returned to a home that felt impossibly silent. The echoes of Luca's laughter, once a soundtrack of warmth and love, haunted the corners of every room. Aisha's belongings, untouched, still bore the scent of her presence. The reality of their absence was crushing. Each object, a cup, a toy, a photo, became a knife, each one reminding him that the people who had anchored his life were gone. Friends and family offered condolences, but words were hollow in the face of such irreparable loss. The community, too, was shaken. Neighbors who had once waved hello now looked on with quiet fear, unable to comprehend the violence that had erupted in their midst. The media sensationalized the story, reporting every detail of the crime, the struggle, and the confrontation. Yet behind the headlines, the true horror lay in the human consequences, the grief, the trauma, and the shattered trust. Parents feared for their children, couples whispered warnings in private, and everyone struggled to reconcile the image of the wedding night with the violence that had replaced it. Court proceedings began weeks later, drawing public attention and a tense, emotional crowd. Maya's demeanor remained disturbingly composed during hearings, alternating between moments of defiance and brief flashes of remorse. Evidence was presented meticulously: security footage, phone messages, the journal, witness testimonies, painting an unrelenting picture of premeditated obsession. Lawyers spoke in hushed, precise tones, their words echoing through the courtroom as the gravity of the case sank in. Emmanuel attended every session, though the weight of his grief made it nearly impossible to remain present. He sat silently, sometimes staring at the floor, other times focusing on Maya, seeing in her a reflection of the life that had been stolen from him. Each revelation in court, each recollection of Maya's actions, drove the pain deeper. Yet, in the midst of sorrow, a fragile sense of closure began to form. The truth had been laid bare. Justice, while unable to restore what was lost, was taking its course. Sentencing brought an eerie stillness to the room. The judge's voice carried authority, reading the charges and the verdicts with careful precision. Maya's sentence was severe, a reflection of the lives destroyed and the calculated nature of her actions. Emmanuel felt a hollow satisfaction, a recognition that consequences had arrived, but it did not fill the void. The courtroom emptied slowly, leaving behind a haunting silence that mirrored the emptiness in his own heart. Friends and family mourned together, holding vigils for Aisha and Luca. The photographs, the memories, the shared stories of love and joy became small anchors for a grieving community. Yet no amount of mourning could undo the night's horror. Emmanuel, though legally vindicated in his actions, lived with the burden of decisions made in desperation, forever marked by the violence that had erupted. Community reactions reflected a mixture of grief, fear, and reflection. Many questioned how obsession could escalate so violently, how a night meant for joy could dissolve into chaos. Parents became more vigilant, couples more wary, and the story of Emmanuel, Aisha, Luca, and Maya became a cautionary tale whispered through neighborhoods, schools, and workplaces. It was a story of love, obsession, grief, and the terrifying consequences of crossing the boundary between desire and destruction. And yet, amid the tragedy, there were moments of fragile humanity. Friends rallied around Emmanuel, helping him navigate grief and the impossible silence of a home emptied of laughter. Support groups formed, sharing stories and offering solace. In quiet moments, he allowed himself to remember Aisha and Luca not only in sorrow, but in love, the warmth they had brought, the joy that had existed, fleeting though it was. These memories became both a comfort and a torment, reminders that life, even when shattered, leaves traces of beauty and love behind. The aftermath of that night stretched far beyond the walls of the reception hall. Lives were irreversibly changed. The story of obsession and violence became a lens through which the community understood fragility, human emotion, and the devastating power of choices made in desperation. And for Emmanuel, every day was a step through grief, a slow, painful journey of navigating loss, seeking understanding, and finding a way to exist in a world that had been forever altered. As the weeks turned into months, Emmanuel moved through a life reshaped by tragedy. The echoes of that night, gunfire, screams, laughter turned to silence, followed him relentlessly, a shadow that refused to lift. He found himself navigating a world that seemed both familiar and alien, where every ordinary moment was tinged with the memory of loss. Even the simplest things, a child running through a park, the sound of wedding music, the smell of roses, brought a hollow ache, a reminder of the life that had been stolen. Yet, amidst the darkness, there was a flicker of something fragile, resilience. Friends and family rallied, helping him rebuild a semblance of normalcy. Support groups, therapy sessions, and shared stories of grief offered him small islands of understanding in an ocean of sorrow. He began to understand that life, though irrevocably changed, still demanded forward motion. He could honor Aisha and Luca not only by mourning them, but by carrying their memory as a light in the bleakness left behind. The community, too, began to heal, though the scar of the tragedy lingered. Conversations shifted, reflections deepened, and caution became wisdom. People asked themselves how obsession could escalate so violently, how a single night could unravel so many lives. The story of Emmanuel, Aisha, Luca, and Maya became more than a headline. It became a cautionary tale, a lesson in human emotion, boundaries, and the catastrophic consequences when love and obsession collide. Emmanuel often visited the places they had once shared: the park where Luca loved to chase pigeons, the small cafe where he and Aisha had celebrated anniversaries, the quiet corners of their home that had once been full of laughter. In each place, he found fragments of their lives, pieces of happiness preserved in memory. He whispered their names into the wind, letting grief mingle with love, realizing that mourning and remembrance were inseparable, two sides of the same fragile coin. He reflected on Maya, too, the woman whose obsession had destroyed everything. Her sentence, though just, offered no comfort, no reprieve for the pain endured. But the understanding of her actions, her motivations, and the sequence of events that had led to the devastation gave him a strange clarity. He saw how human emotion, when unchecked and manipulated, could lead to irreversible consequences. The lesson was bitter, but it was real. In the evenings, Emmanuel would sometimes sit alone, watching the sunset filter through the curtains. The world carried on beyond the walls of grief, indifferent yet persistent, demanding life continue. And in those quiet moments, he felt both the weight of loss and the faint glimmer of something beyond despair, acceptance, fragile but growing. The story of that night, of obsession, betrayal, grief, and revenge had left indelible marks on every life it touched. But even in its horror, it offered a stark reminder. Human emotion is powerful, unpredictable, and capable of both unimaginable love and unimaginable destruction. Choices, words, and unchecked desires can alter lives forever. And as Emmanuel whispered one final goodnight to the memory of Aisha and Luca, he understood something profound, that even in the deepest darkness, the echoes of love can endure. That memory, though painful, could carry him forward. That life, though forever scarred, still held the possibility of meaning, of growth, and of resilience. The night that had begun as a celebration ended as a nightmare, but in the aftermath, in the quiet spaces between grief and remembrance, there remained a lesson as enduring as it was haunting. Love, obsession, and loss are intertwined, and the choices we make in their shadows define the lives we leave behind. Even when everything is taken, even when the world seems broken beyond repair, there is a way to remember, to honor, and to survive. And that is the haunting, powerful truth of this story, a story that began with celebration and ended with a revelation of the darkest corners of the human heart.